So my name is Brady Huang. I'm one of the musculoskeletal radiologists here at UCSD. And we're going to go through kind of a case-based approach to MRI. We're first going to start talking about large joint. And these are things that you're going to see commonly in day-to-day practice and also in the board situation. For those of you who have already graduated and doing your ABR OLA, these are things that are going to show up on those multiple choice questions. I just wanted to put a shout out to the RSNA for their RAD report website. For those of you who are using standardized reports, great. If you are not, this is a good resource if you're trying to kind of set up your MSK templates for the first time. And they have basically templates for everything, not just MSK, but across all disciplines of radiology. But I'll try to present with each joint kind of how I approach the joint-specific structures that I'll be wanting to look at. So let's start with the shoulder. It's one of the bread and butter joints that we look at in terms of MRI. And most of the time, the things that we're looking for are things like cuff disorders, cuff tendinosis, tendon tears, biceps tendon problems in the glenohumeral joint, and that, as you know, can be in the form of labral tears, cartilage lesions. And finally, we'll touch on the coracoacromial arch. So first, rotator cuff tears, it's probably the vast majority of MRIs that are ordered are for this specific indication. And it's important that you have the phraseology in mind when you're trying to describe these accurately to your orthopedic surgeon, especially if they're going to go in and do some sort of intervention, such as a shoulder arthroscopy. So it's important to identify anatomically the location of these cuff tears, whether it's along the bursal surface or the superior surface where that subacromial subdeltoid bursa lives. So you can see this high signal intensity tear. And really what we want to look for is fluid signal intensity on those fluid sensitive sequences. Because if it's just sort of a gentle gray or if it's darker in signal intensity, then that's more in keeping with tendinosis, okay? So here we have a bursal surface tear. Here on the other extreme, you have an articular sided tear. So that's going to be on the humeral head articular surface there. And these are going to be examples of partial thickness tears. So you want to estimate, whether it's a moderate grade. Some people use that to equate 50%, or some people will just give the percentage of the tear. This is about a 50% thickness tear. The other location that can be a little bit tricky for both you and the surgeon are these intrasubstance tears because they're entirely hidden within the substance of the cuff tendon. And sometimes I'll go as far as even saying that this can be hidden at the time of arthroscopy. And finally, these are pretty much no-brainers. Your full thickness tears, often accompanied by retraction of the torn tendon. You can see this tendon stump. And it is important to relay in your report the anatomic location of this tendon stump because the more retracted it is, it's going to be more difficult for them to pull that back and reattach it when they do a rotator cuff repair.
This is a big topic, okay? So we're going to kind of go quickly, but you have a lot in your slides, and I'm available for questions. These are my disclosures. We're going to really talk about the role of IR in cancer care. I want those of you who do diagnostic to really understand how you and IR can kind of support each other. I want you to understand ablation and catheter-directed therapies and how we can treat cancers of the liver, lung, kidney, and bone. And then the real frontier is IR in palliation and MSK, pain. So IO has become the fourth pillar of cancer care, interventional oncology, and even more so because of the capacity to combine interventional oncology with immuno-oncology. They're very synergistic, and that's an area of a lot of research, including in my laboratory. So what we do really spans the gamut from biopsy for diagnosis. We have various treatment modalities. We offer supportive care that helps patients receive other treatments or helps deal with the side effects of either cancer or of treatments. And then at the palliation stage, which a lot of people forget, the neurocryolysis, drainages, and fixation of fractures that can happen pathologically. So we're going to enter into ablation. The ablative modalities really began as liquid agents, which are like a bag of cats. You really can't control where ethanol goes, but it's effective. It causes coagulation, necrosis. Then you have the thermal ones, and thermal includes both really, really cold, which is cryoablation, or really, really hot, which is microwave or RFA. And then there's the non-thermal, which is irreversible electroporation, and this is where you pass electricity and it makes holes in a cell, and the cell can't close the holes again. Histotripsy is kind of a new focused ultrasound that uses mechanical energy to disrupt cells. And these are all very exciting because ablation is essentially surgery without surgery, right? You can destroy cancers in situ. Patients come in with a cancer, they leave with a Band-Aid. It's fantastic. So absolute ethanol is what we use for ethanol ablation, and I still use this in opportunities like when you're trying to get along a margin that might be difficult, or if I'm trying to ablate a tract after I do a biopsy, because it has the two things that you really want. You want coagulation because you don't want them to bleed, and necrosis because you don't want to spread those cancer cells. So for example, yesterday we did a kidney biopsy. At the end, they pulled out gel foam, and I said, no, let's do ethanol because let's put in a little extra because what if we kill this cancer? And I do have a partner who did an entire ablation with just ethanol of a papillary renal cell, and it was completely treated. It's cheap. You can use it next to sensitive structures, but it's hard to ensure complete ablation.
Quick show of hands going into the OB lecture. How many of you do anatomy scans in the second trimester? Oh, good. A few. Anyone do high risk? Okay, interesting. Okay, so on the cine loop here, we're just showing unknown case. So what is that? We did see a case of this with Dr. Richmond yesterday. So we see some eyeballs there, right? The orbits are there, but nothing above that, right? So this is what? Chiari, sacrococcygeal teratoma, anencephaly, or caudal regression. So just to look again here, see no structures above the level of the eyes there, the so-called frog, I think that's a harsh term, but frog face view, something that shows us anencephaly. Okay, so there's that nice unknown warm-up case. So just an overview, ultrasound and fetal safety. Diagnostic ultrasound is considered safe during pregnancy. Performed, though, only for medical indications. So the society guidelines say don't go to the mall, to that ultrasound suite, just to get pretty pictures, though even at our institution we do give the moms pretty pictures, of course, and we even have a cloud-based system where they get sent directly to them now instead of just the thermal printout. So ALARA is, even though it's safe ultrasound, we still want to practice ALARA. We don't want to be sitting there with high TIS and looking at things forever, and I'll talk about mechanical and thermal index in a second. Mechanical index causes cavitation in soft tissue. Thermal index is a measure of the propensity to increase temperature in tissue. So you want to keep those numbers around 1 or lower most of the time. It's okay to crank it up briefly as needed for diagnostic purposes. And those numbers can generally be found at the top of your ultrasound images there, so MI and TI, for example. Note that when you put on pulse Doppler, the TI goes up quite a bit. So the TI here with pulse Doppler is 3. So pulse Doppler you can use, no problem, but you don't want to just sit there for several minutes at a time. Just use it and turn it off when you're done. So in very early obstetrical imaging, we want to look for that gestational sac. We want to evaluate all the uterine, cervical, adnexal structures. We want to document presence or absence of yolk sac and the embryo. If there is an embryo, we want to measure the crown rump length. That is the more accurate way to date and size the pregnancy. If there is no crown rump length yet measurable because the embryo is either absent or too small, then to see, then we want to use the mean gestational sac diameter. It's not the middle number, it's not the biggest number, it's the mean average of the 3 different orthogonal measurements of the gestational sac. Make sure your sonographer clicks all 3 buttons there.